Hi, this is Scott Park Phillips, and we're all lucky today to have Louis Komjathy here with us. He is the most important independent scholar of Daoism, prolific. Was there at my first introduction to the academic community back in '98. And we're roughly about the same age. He was a prodigy or what do you call it? A protege of Livia Cohn, and he has many books. And if you don't know who he is, you should. You're now living in Chicago and working as an independent scholar, and you teach online mostly, but do also give public talks. And our connection, I'll just say, is through Liu Ming, I started studying with in 1994, and I think you were somewhere in the late 90s. We were in different cities, so we didn't spend a lot of time together, but we did meet at an academic conference on Vashon Island, which in some ways was the beginning of the modern Daoist Studies, or at least conference phenomenon. And it was an amazing event. There was all sorts of really interesting people there. And the Liu Ming was a controversial figure probably before either of us met him. Well, when I first met him, his name was Charles Bellier, and I've written about him. I will link to that article so that we don't have to spend a lot of time on that. But he was very opinionated about the nature of Daoism, and that had a huge influence on both of us. And two mutual friends of ours in academia, who are both in the realm of anthropology and history and film studies, Elijah Siegler and David Palmer. David Palmer, most famous for his book Qigong Fever, put out a book called Dream Trippers, which is mostly about the Mantak Chia phenomena as it progressed and got devotees in the West and their influence on Chinese Taoism. And I read the book, and in the book they make Louis a kind of straw man for a type of American Taoism which is deeply concerned with authenticity and with the authenticity of lineage. And having known Liu Ming, I know that those views came initially from him. And so Louis, of course, can speak for himself, but I recommend the book, although it is a problem that if you're reading it as me, you're going, well, that could have been me he's talking about. I had the personal, I could have been the straw man too. But Louis made a better straw man because of his connection to the Cohn in many ways, and his academic career. So that's just a little bit of background. Welcome. How'd I do on the introduction?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't have probably presented myself that way. Yeah, my relationship with Liu Ming was, indirect and somewhat complicated. So I think I would kind of frame some of these I guess constructs or ideas about Taoism as actually rooted more in Michael Sasow's work, and that was obviously very influential on Liu Ming. In fact, this was an explicit conversation with David and Elijah because they wanted to use Liu Ming's framework through Michael Sasow and also related to Christopher Schipper's work to talk about Zhengyi, Orthodox unity through this idea of orthodoxy. And I said, I have no interest in orthodoxy. This is not my category. I think it's even problematic to translate Zheng as orthodox, even though maybe in the context of Zhengyi Orthodox unity, that's appropriate. So, we kind of went back and forth with this. I was obviously involved in the book pretty early on, also helping them think about it, challenging certain ideas. And as you said, I mean, it's their book, so they presented it how they wanted. but I think there's a whole bunch of issues, that come up with, these questions of orthodoxy, which I don't think is really a Taoist category, with the idea of authenticity. So that was a kind of compromise category where they said, it seems like this is actually something you care about. And I said, yeah, on some level I do, especially thinking about Jun, right? So what's the relationship to these
Jun,
kind of
truth, real,
yeah, perfect, whatever it happens to
perfect.
be, like Trenchen, right, which is the tradition, the movement or the sub tradition of Taoism that I'm more connected to. So complete perfection in that case, but thinking about that as a possibility of like genuine or authentic or true or real, as you said. So yeah, I think that just needs to be qualified a bit about where I'm actually located in all this. So my own history is in that, well, is my history in that book. Some of my history is in that book. So
All right, let me slow down. Let me first make a correction or another thing, that there's another reason why they chose you for that is your experience studying in China, which I can ask you to talk a little bit about because it's relevant to this much bigger subject. And the other thing, just to clarify for people, so there's two terms here, Zheng and Jun, and Zheng is often translated orthodox unity, something like that. And Jun is is real or perfect, perfection. And these two terms are linked to two Taoist movements. I don't know if I don't want to call them secular. I don't want to call them mass movements. They are or social movements. They're religious phenomena, we'll call them, right? So it's Zhengyi and Quanzhen, and roughly Zhengyi is the priest tradition, and Zhengyi is the monastic tradition. Those Quanzhen, sorry, what did I say? Never mind. That they are. But of course, those categories are also have always been extremely disrupted. Taoists have not held to them through history. So
yeah, and just to
yeah,
say, not to get too deep into the language, but
yeah,
obviously what these terms mean changes over time in different contexts. They mean different things. So I'm perfectly happy, like with Michael Sassa and Christopher Schipper, that Zhengyi becomes talked about as Orthodox unity. I think it's fine in that context, right? But then you have this question of, but like, what is Zheng actually about, right? And I think this does relate to these questions of authenticity. I don't think it is a question of orthodoxy. I think it's a question of alignment. I think it's a question of connection, right? This is also related to translation, how I think about translation, the relationship between like the source texts and the target texts or the actual translations and so on. So it's just to say, I think there is a language component that's related to how we understand Taoism. And if we think about Taoism through those categories, through an English translation of them, and more to the point of what we're looking at here is, how are we located in Taoism? If we are there actual lineages? What are the qualities or the characteristics of those lineages? But also, like, what are their concerns? And so are they really, in this case, are they really concerned about orthodoxy? So, right. And in the case of Dream Trippers, and I think we can kind of set that aside, but in the case of Dream Trippers, it's like, oh, everybody's arguing about orthodoxy. It's like, I'm not interested in orthodoxy. I'm not arguing about orthodoxy. There is, I think, this question, as you and I had separate conversations about authenticity, and I don't mean it in a narrow Taoist sense. I mean it in the sense of being human and what
yeah.
we're doing with our lives and these kinds of things. So, yeah.
Well, so what I'd like to do for people listening to this is for us to just have I don't know, this is a free form, like, since we both, I think, are pretty confident with Taoist history, we can have a little back and forth about what it is for a few minutes and then go to what it's becoming, something like that.
Sure.
Um, so where do you start? Have you by chance read Livia Cohn's book Pristine? Something was
No.
do I have it? Well, it's an interesting place to start because so the Tao Te Ching is I think everyone would agree, is the most central Daoist text and the first clearly defined Daoist text thing. It having a deep affiliation with the Tao Te Ching does not necessarily make you Taoist, but through history, nearly all Taoists have had a close relationship with this book of 81 chapters. And would you agree?
Yes, with some
Okay,
qualifications, but we can
good,
go
good.
with it. We can go with it.
We can go with it. And what is that? The reason I mentioned Libby Cohen's book is she actually has a great theory, which I don't agree with, but it's a good way to think about things, which is that the Lao Tzu in some ways is pointing to something deep in the past, a time that is simpler, in some and there is kind of archaeological evidence that there may have been such a time, a period of great abundance. And there's so much we could talk about with the Tao Te Ching, but the Tao Te Ching is written somewhere around 300 or 400 BCE, and or comes into a form that is coherent, and becomes more and more solidified as the Chinese Empire itself becomes more solidified. And you then have some very key figures. Liu An organizes the Huainanzi, which is an encyclopedic collection of material which is the basis for a lot of what we call Daoism. There are also a bunch of other books that have had strong influences on what we call Daoism. From the Zhuangzi would be the other major one, the Leizi, but there are more. And we keep learning more about this early era from tombs. We keep finding older versions of the Tao Te Ching and such things, and the books that accompanied it. And then you start to have commentaries on the Tao Te Ching, He Shanggong being one of the earliest ones. And then you get this character, Zhang Daoling. Do you want to take it from there or comment on what I just said?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. If people are familiar with, my revisionist scholarship, I mean, what I talk about is the 7 periods and the 4 divisions. So what we're really talking about here is classical Taoism as the origins of Taoism. We can say, if we accept the dating of the Neya inward training around 350 BCE, so we can kind of use that as a start date of a kind of textual tradition that's emerging.
So Neya is an inner classic that's part of the Guanzi, which is an older book.
Yeah, yeah. So the Guanzi is quite complicated in terms of historical and textual layers, but this is one of the earliest texts that seems to have been collected, right, in that anthology. And so there are a lot of kind of revisionist views of what this text is. But I think in my way of thinking about it, it's talking about classical Taoism as starting around like 350 BCE, but then that means there was like an earlier oral tradition, and thinking about these master disciple communities, right, that a lot of which are documented from my perspective in the Zhuangzi. So I have this like interpretive study and annotated translation of the Tao Te Ching that's about to be published, and I go through this systematically. So I kind of try to show the actual evidence for what we call like the intercultivation lineages of classical Taoism. So who are these teachers? What were they teaching? What were their kind of shared views and commitments and so on? So yeah, I think in my way of thinking about this is the beginning of the Taoist tradition, right? And so then of course you have to add some of these materials through a revisionist framework, which you mentioned, moving into like the Huainanzi, right, which is kind of like conventionally dated to 139 BCE. So we've got this kind of time frame. If people look at the work, they'll see I'm actually making an argument that the Shiji, the records of the historian, so this important Chinese historical text, they were probably Daoist sympathizers, the Sima family. They might have even been adherents of Taoism. So that's quite controversial to say the latter piece. But the reason I say that is that text was finished around 90 BCE. So if we think about that and we say, okay, the Ne is like 350 BCE, there are layers of the Zhuangzi, there are layers of the Tao Te Ching that probably date from that too. We've got this kind of time frame, right? So we can just say from around 350 BCE to around 100 BCE, where there's this emerging tradition. And there's a pretty strong, and this is part of why I brought up the book, is to say, I found a fair amount of evidence that I think suggests a kind of self-referential idea of classical Taoism, even though people are kind of reading over this, right? These technical terms.
I just want to stop you for a second. And so, like, I totally agree with this, and it's hilarious. You know, I've gone to conferences where I hear these presentations on some part of the Zhuangzi, and I'm like, you know, they're talking about meditation, right?
Right.
And we still do that type of meditation today.
Right.
You know, oh, there's no evidence for that. Like, that's not true. Anyway, keep going.
Yeah, no, and so I think that this is important because if we think of that time frame and then we move to something like the Celestial Masters, you know, just to kind of give people a quick history, where a lot of people will kind of identify the emergence of Taoism at that point, at least as an organized religion. So I actually think classical Taoism was religious in characteristics too.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of problematic, right, construction of, oh, there's philosophy and there's religion. But the reason I say that is with the Celestial Masters, you have more of a kind of ecclesiastical framework. You have ordained priests, you have ritual, and the things that people tend to think of as institutional religion. So that revelation becomes the basis of what we talked about at the beginning of Zhengyi, or Orthodox unity, you know, and then it's not, and then
let me just stop you because they're conflating three things here. So Zheng Daoling is credited by the Celestial Masters, who don't really get their name or their institution for another 500 years, really. But they all credit Zheng Daoling and his family as the source of their priestly lineages and tradition, and in fact their communal tradition, their community around the Tan, around an altar, and that tradition comes from there, and that's also what we call Zhengyi. So there's Tianshi, Celestial Masters, and Zhengyi, Orthodox unity, or whatever we want to call it. Both are two different terms for a not exactly the same thing, but a similar thing that is traced to Zheng Daoling, which is in about 50 CE. The revelation of Zheng Daoling, approximately. Yeah, so keep going. I just want to make sure that people are following that.
Yeah, and I think, you know, for the I don't know how much this is really going to be helpful for people thinking about, you know, the main topic we're thinking about today of global Taoism, but I think the only other thing I would add for that as a kind of quick history is what we mentioned at the beginning, which is then the Shenzhen, the complete perfection movement, which is, you know, a lot of what my earlier scholarship was on, and then technically the sub-tradition or the movement that I'm part of, you know, that starts around, right, basically the late 12th century. So very much later. So a lot happens in Taoist history up until that moment. And then that becomes, as you said, the dominant form of Taoist monasticism. And then when we move into the modern world, we have Zhengyi as largely the householder tradition and Shenzhen as largely the monastic tradition. And then, but that's institutional Taoism, right? So what about all the other kind of expressions of Taoism in the modern world? And that's a very complicated subject.
Yeah, so yeah, so we can skip over the middle part, I think. Although I at some point would like you to talk about the Baoputsu translation, but let's do that toward the end.
Okay.
Just to speak about the Celestial Masters, because there are some new books out. Vincent Goussert has a couple new books out. There's a great book on the institution of the Celestial Masters with the Tianshi and its relationship to the Imperial China, because it was a particular family that claimed origins with Zheng Daoling 1,000 years earlier. So sometime around the 10th to 12th century, this institution, which was essentially a family, in around Lunghushan, Dragon Tiger Mountain, in southern China, developed a particular form of ritual and a particular form of ordaining people as in the tradition of Daoism. So the ordaining priests, you could say, that had to do with something called transmitting registers, which were ways of contacting the unseen world. But they were much more than that, because they were signifiers of you being part of a community. And they as they grew in power, let's say between the 10th and the 13th century, they took on the role of ordaining or including. They did rituals. They toured the country regularly, and they ordained everyone that they considered Taoist or Taoist-like. And so there are all these lineages, and they wouldn't do everybody every time, but they created this momentum, and everyone who was ordained was sending records of their relationship with every local cult. So Taoism, in a sense, infused itself into the society, into all of the local cults that were around. And we talk about what Zhang Daoling said in the first century CE. One of his first revelation is, don't get in the way of people's relationship to heaven. Like, that's the first precept. It's a Wu Wei precept. It's a don't do precept. And the way in which this was interpreted over 1500 years, or a way, was that you would interact with these local cults in order to not to suppress them, but to include them. And their prime, you might say, this is maybe not exactly right, but their primary method of including was to regulate offerings. Because the second claim of Zhang Daoling in the first century CE was that you should not make sacrifices to gods. If a god requires a sacrifice, and we're here really talking about blood sacrifice, then it's a demon, not a god. And that changed that may be an older tradition, but that changed the landscape, and that it definitely draws on, we can talk about that too, on earlier material, but that fundamentally defines a kind of underlying ethic of Taoism, of not making sacrifice, and redefines it. You might say, again, this is somewhat modern way of looking at it, but redefines that as offerings. So the local community wants to sacrifice a virgin or kill the king, like, I will go and be an intermediate. I, as a Taoist priest, will be an intermediary, and with this unseen world of gods and demons, and I will negotiate somehow a lesser offering. So let's just offer grain, and Taoists had some pull. They had connections to the government. There were advantages for local people agreeing to these kinds of things. It's complex, and it's extremely local, and it's extremely diverse. But that phenomena, you might say, like, human offerings, animal offerings, simple blood offerings that don't kill the animal, and then moving into grain, and then incense, flowers, and then emptiness, offering offering integrity, offering good work, offering gongfu, your merit.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll just step in and say,
Yeah,
Shenzhen is radically different from this. So,
well, it's good.
Yeah, so Shenzhen's appearing in the 12th century. It becomes the dominant kind of tradition in North China, under the Mongol Yuan. And so it's really important also to kind of say there's another kind of Taoist sub-tradition that isn't engaging in this kind of activity, that's focusing more on internal cultivation. I mean, this is part of my interest in Shenzhen, right? That Shenzhen's actually taking on a lot of the earlier Taoist materials and saying we're interested in kind of inner cultivation. It's not a ritualistic tradition. I mean, it incorporates ritual later on, But early on, it's really emphasizing kind of seclusion, intensive meditation practice, internal alchemy, right? Mystical experience, all of these kinds of things. So, I think for our purposes here, we can just say, like, as you move in, to the modern period, into the contemporary period, these are the two kind of dominant forms of institutional Taoism, one being more of a household or ritualistic tradition, more temple-based and community-based, the other being, that is, Zhengyi Orthodox unity, and then Chenjen being more of the monastic tradition.
Absolutely. But I would just point out that the householder tradition was also focused on golden elixir, on Jindan practices. It just doesn't present them in quite such a central way, but it is an intrinsic part of Taoist ritual.
Yes, I think certain elements, certain expressions of Taoist ritual, that's the case, and depending on who's doing it. But that's okay. Yes, it's part of it too. And also, like, the Zhengyi Chenjen kind of construct isn't the whole story. So you have these other kinds of lineages and, like, more local movements, regional movements, but even like family traditions that don't necessarily fit into that particular framework. So that's important to also be thinking about in the modern world.
Absolutely, many family traditions,
Right.
and that is sort of why I made the statement about this one family that started registering everyone, because they were very convincing.
Right.
But there are families, in far-flung parts of China that got the registration twice over 700 years, and the rest of the time they're doing their own thing.
Right.
Whoa, that's cool. I mean, for a broader audience, we ought to say that this same period birthed Zen or Chan, and that there's an enormous influence from Taoism on that as well. And we should probably also say, because it's so obvious to us, but not necessarily to everyone else, that one of the things that really makes Taoism unique in the world is its emphasis on the body. And that both of these, I don't even feel comfortable saying both of these traditions, but they are divergent, right? Both of these divergences, we might say, are both have an enormous centrality of the body and text, we could say. Yeah. What do you want to spend a little more time talking about Zhuangzhen and its how it forms into, how it gets us to the 20th century, maybe?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that one of the things that happens, right, is if you start to look at the history, is there's this kind of oscillation between the dominance of Orthodox unity and the dominance of complete perfection, right? And how they occupy the landscape and how they feed into the modern world. And then, I think when we start to talk about global Taoism, how people might be more located in an Orthodox unity kind of sub-tradition, or how people might be located more in a complete perfection sub-tradition, and what's being emphasized and why, right? So those kinds of things I think might be helpful, but the main thing I think is really to kind of think about the tradition as this very diverse kind of descent, even though the Celestial Masters or Orthodox unity, well, even now with the Chinese Taoist Association, that they're trying to make some kind of centralized authority. Historically, that wasn't the case. So the majority of Taoists had nothing to do with some kind of overseeing authority that was mandating how they were going to live their lives. And I think that's one of the powerful things about Taoism as a tradition, is that kind of diversity and that recognition, or that inclusiveness, that recognition of different people have different paths. There are different ways to approach cultivation. There are different ways to live our lives. And that's more of what I see. So in my own way of kind of, I think, researching but presenting Taoism, it's like, there's something like the 7 periods and the 4 divisions, but also thinking about models, right? Models of practice and attainment, and what those are. So, I mean, I'm happy to speak more about Shenzhen, but I don't know how
no, we have something to leap over here to get to the next conversation. Let me see. there's
I mean, I'll just say one of the things that comes up for me in a modern context,
Mhm.
right, is a kind of inquiry about our own affinities and our own aspirations. So when you look at this, right, it's like, well, do you want to have a family? Do you want to have children? Well, Orthodox unity tends to support that more. Do you think Taoism is more about a kind of family located in community, participating in these kinds of communal events? That's more of like an Orthodox unity kind of approach. You know, if you think about Chenjen, it's more saying, you know, no, we're largely renouncing that. So, of course, this gets very complicated in real life on the ground. Like most Chenjen Taoists I know still have contact with their families. So, even though they're not getting married and they're not having children, they're networked in to their largely family relationships. A lot of them even send back money to their families, right, from the monasteries. So it's a kind of complicated thing. It's not as clear as if you say, oh, it's more of a kind of institutionalized asceticism or renunciant tradition, but not exactly, because it's so Chinese, right? Like, can you really renounce your family relationships? Can you renounce your ancestry from a traditional Chinese perspective? But part of the reason to bring that up is there is this element of saying, I'm not going to reproduce the social order, right? So, or am I? Or how am I going to do it? Or how am I going to participate in the social order? And I do see this as an actually deep contemplative inquiry, you know, that people doing like serious practice should be considering, right? So in my case, it's like, well, if you don't want to reproduce the dominant social order, how do you live your life? And do you choose to kind of embrace something like the non-reproduction of the status quo? And there are many ways we can do that. And I think that would be a more modern kind of Chenjen insight, right? Is you don't have to blindly reproduce what's being done or just say, well, this is how I was educated, right? Or this is how I was conditioned by the dominant society. We can pause and say, is this actually a choice that I want to make? You know, and so I think there's something deeper in all of this than just this is, and it's like what you said, well, that's not the whole story, household or monastic. That's not the whole story of ritual meditation or ritual internal alchemy. But it's helpful to think through those questions of, if we are engaging, it doesn't have to be Taoist, if we're engaging in spiritual practice or spiritual cultivation, what are we trying to do in our lives, right? And one thing is that, like, where does family and society fit into this?
well, so I think there's I think we should make clear that because especially people who are martial artists seem to think that there was this cultural revolution and it was absolutely horrible, and don't seem to realize that there was a lot of stuff that happened before that, and it's a little bit hard to track, you know, this question of like how Taoism shows up in a global context, and then what we make of it, you know, not having known what it passed through. So what so you already said that there's these shifting power dynamics in the last, so in the Qing dynasty, and it's between 1644, the date they give, in 1912, there's a lot of shifting dynamics, but in many ways Taoism is still pretty strong on the ground, like and then the 20th century hits, and I call this the YMCA consensus, that you know, all of the new leaders have been trained through missionary schools, or almost all of them, or military schools. You know, they went to Germany and studied, and the new leadership is, in a sense, under a very particular Western type of indoctrination, which is anti-ritual. It's anti-theater, which had been the major experience of religion for the average person. That's how people learned about the gods, was through theater. It was anti-theater, it was anti-ritual, it was anti-theater, and it had very, I call YMCA, very YMCA views about the body. That, you know, was anti-Chinese medicine, in fact, for the first part, very strongly. And so it's this wild turmoil where that happens. Of course, there's all this Daoism happening, but what happens to the institutions, they fragment and they attempt to adapt. And all Daoism, as far as I can tell, attempted to adapt. And so you get a version of Chuanzhen that it doesn't really even see itself separate from the ritual tradition, but it attempts to take the golden Jindan, the golden elixir, and kind of separate it from the ritual or monastic traditions. And someone we both know of, Liu Shun, has written basically a book, Daoist Moderns, where he tracks a couple of sort of very highly literate Daoists who are attempting to transform create a kind of modern Daoism that is acceptable to the new, what we might call secular modernism. And there are lots of movements like that. There's also David Palmer has written a lot about what's now called redemption societies, which are, combine lots of religious traditions, including Christianity and Islam, but into a weird kind of mix that has a lot of Taoism in it, right? But they're free floating. They can move between cities very easily. They don't need an altar. They don't need a mountain, right? And so these kinds of things travel very easily to Taiwan and Singapore, for instance. But so do the older traditions. So in Taiwan and Singapore, you do have these Taoist ritual traditions, but the monastic tradition doesn't move there as easily. It moves as a practice tradition, I would say. And that I'm sort of trying to set that up. Of course, the Cultural Revolution happens, or really the Great Leap Forward happens, and then or communism happens, and there's huge suppression of Taoism. Taoism's functionally illegal, and grounds for being tortured to death, and so people just go into hiding, but they keep creeping back out every once in a while, and they bury stuff, and after the Cultural Revolution, you have a level, in the 90s, really, you have a level of sharing going on that probably didn't even happen so much before. That's sort of another phenomenon, which I think contributes to its spread worldwide, a kind of openness, because that thing is nearly dying if we don't open up and share, I think was a common value. Anyway, that's a lot of material, man. Go for it. Rip it
Yeah,
apart.
I mean, I think
Whatever you
for
want.
our purposes, I mean, one thing is the kind of anti-traditionalism, that happens basically with the end of the Qing dynasty, the beginning of the Republican period, as you said, moving into the kind of communist revolution and the Cultural Revolution, and all these kinds of things. So yeah, one part is the massive disruption, the anti-traditionalism, which Taoism gets put into that. The kind of rejection of religion as feudal superstition. So this is why Confucianism kind of fares a bit better as you kind of look into the revitalization movements, right, of Ruism or so-called Confucianism is, oh, we're not a religion, right? We were never categorized that way in modernity. It's like, okay, well, that's because they miscategorized you, right? But that's another
Exactly.
story.
Right.
So,
They had dances, right? The
right,
Confucians actually had dances you had to learn. Yeah.
but in the context of Taoism, I mean, they get categorized that way. And so therefore, by definition, you are outdated, you are backward, you are part of the reason, that we were conquered. And so then there's that whole kind of a nativist kind of upbuilding, which is still going on, obviously. And the reason I think this is important for us is, yeah, so there's massive disruption, there's anti-traditionalism, there's a whole reconstruction of what it means to be Chinese, how you would fit into a modern Chinese state, and then, of course, moving into this contemporary period, well, how do Daoists fit into that project, right? But also what you said is that this leads to the migration of a number of Daoists out of China, a larger dissemination, and then also a re-engagement with modern China, contemporary China, through the lens of, well, is Taoism still alive? Where is Taoism flourishing? If it is flourishing, can you study there? these kinds of questions, but also the fact that now you've got a larger global community, some of which is, as we know, like immigrant ethnically Chinese Daoists, but also Euro-American convert Daoists and converts, quote unquote, from all different backgrounds, and on and on and on. So yeah, this, even though I think it is, and I'm not saying whether or not you're saying, I'm saying, I think it is right to say it was massive disruption. It was detrimental to Daoism. It led to really severe consequences for what I'm interested in, something like tradition-based Daoism, that's kind of self-consciously doing something that's specifically Daoist rather than, oh yeah, how are we going to fit into the modern Chinese communist state, right? And then, but then that also, it's like what happened with Tibetan Buddhism too, that disruption is actually what led to globalization, you know? So if that hadn't happened, would we really have what I, tend to talk about as global Daoism rather than Chinese Daoism? And we can talk more about that too. But I think this is important for our conversation. And if people are interested in this, how to think through it, is even though it was catastrophic, right, for Daoism in mainland China, it also opened up this possibility of what we're looking at today.
Yeah, really, that was really nice. Yeah, I mean, I think we just did a pretty good job. I think people
And,
are
and the
like,
only other thing I think I'll say, that I want to say based upon the earlier moment of the conversation is it's I don't know. I tend not to use authenticity, but whatever, as you said, this was the kind of category that I was put into, or that the conversation unfolded that way.
Yeah.
But I think there is this kind of question of something that I tend to call like tradition-based Taoism.
Yeah.
Right. So that doesn't mean it's like traditional. It means that we actually recognize that there's this indigenous Chinese and now global religion called Taoism. And there's certain aspects that are part of that tradition that we may or may not have affinity with, we may or may not connect with, but that there is this question of where is all of this stuff coming from? And as you know, a good portion of it's not coming from Taoism. So the whole marketing of whatever it happens to be, whatever's labeled Daoist, and that's maybe an authenticity question, but it's also, I think, a tradition-based question. It's also, I think that's why I brought up the translation aspect of, well, most of the Tao Te Ching translations aren't actually translations of the Tao Te Ching. So are they giving you access to the primary Chinese Taoist source text? And that's a kind of question of, right, continuity or connection that you could think of along these lines. So to use like the actual language of the Tao Te Ching, Gui Gun, returning to the root or returning to the source. What is the root of these translations? Well, there's a Chinese source text. And I think the same thing with us talking about global Taoism, there's a source tradition. That's very complicated, like we just went through relatively quickly, but there are these questions of origin, right? Questions of influence, and just what you said, even with mainland Chinese Taoism, like is mainland Chinese Taoism becoming more of a kind of Disney theme park because of the Bureau of Tourism than a kind of religious tradition or a sacred site or these kinds of things?
Yeah. Well, yeah, maybe integrity is a better word than authenticity in that sense, because the reason authenticity can be the right word is that this question about like, do we have some measure of whether or not this thing is Taoism? And I want to tell a little story as a way of just sort of bringing this sort of into the boundaries of what Taoism in the modern world. That's particularly potent because on March 11th, Keith Johnstone passed away, and Keith Johnstone, I met him when I was 15, and I'll tell that story in a second. But he is the pioneer in the West of theatrical improvisation. He is way more significant in terms of its birth than say Second City or Saturday Night Live which is the other thing that people will tend to reference. But Johnstone came before that. And in his book, in the introduction, he talks about unlearning, about having to unlearn his education. And the teacher who started him on this path of unlearning was an art teacher. And this art teacher was using the Tao Te Ching as the basis for his lessons, which you could call an unlearning process, right? 补志. And so in this introduction to the book, he actually has some commentary on the Tao Te Ching from the perspective of a theater guy. And I hit this book at 15. To tell Johnstone's story a little bit, he was big in the Royal Theatre and the Royal Academy in London, and Samuel Beckett said he did Johnstone directed the best ever version of Waiting for Godot. So he's like a little bit important, right? And he created something called the Theater Machine, which was an entirely improvisational theater group that toured. And they developed a way, fundamentally, what this group of people did, so they developed a kind of openness that is not domain specific. We know about it through theater because that's what he taught. But throughout his life, he was teaching in many different domains, people how to be spontaneous, or what we would call 自然. That there is a fundamentally a pivot point that defines something about Taoism. It's a kind of openness that allows for spontaneity in many different realms, and it's a type of fruition that is recognizable. And it's weird because he clearly doesn't have any lineage there, right? But was able to tap into something that is intrinsic to being human. And so he was just having this broader influence. I guess, again, multi-domain. He was being brought down to Stanford to teach in the improvisation at the engineering department, to Stanford to loosen up the engineers. And some person in the theater department there was connected to the San Francisco Zen Center, where my father was like, his best friend was Dick Baker, the founder of the San Francisco Zen Center, at early on, and so I had a close connection, and my father and I both separately took a class that Johnstone offered to Zen students, because from an American Zen point of view, this type of spontaneity was, again, a demonstrative type of fruition of practice, and they were interested in what the connection might be. And I took this class and absolutely blew my mind. It was like I was suddenly 15 and I could see hierarchies. I could see status transactions in human beings. It freed me, deeply freed me. And I would not have ended up as a dancer. I wouldn't have ended up, I doubt I would have ended up doing the arts. And I very much would not have ended up in Taoism if I didn't have that initial framing. And so I'm saying all that because that late me as a whatever 3 generations later, to be able to go deep, really deep into something, right? What are these fundamental types of fruition that are associated with Taoist religion, and how do they spread in the West? That's my story.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I would say that is not your construction, but I think it's one of the constructions that's at work in global Taoism, modern Taoism, contemporary Taoism, is this idea that you have to have lineage to be a Taoist, which is not the case, right? So yes, I mean, it's just what you said. I mean, these status transactions. I mean, there's a reason that certain people want to construct Taoism in particular ways. So, that's not the way I look at it. So I've been very clear talking to people about global Taoism I do think there's a source tradition. I do think there's a question of connection, but lineage is only one source of connection, and it may not be relevant to most people, right? And this has been true historically in Taoism. I mean, the majority of Taoists were not Daoshi. They weren't. They weren't ordained Taoist priests or monastics with a kind of formal affiliation. They weren't. They were Daoren. They were people of the Tao. And I think there's a lot of misconception about that. So it's like, you don't need ordination to be a Taoist. You don't need lineage to be a Taoist, right? You don't need to be Chinese to be a Taoist. Yes. You don't need to know Chinese language to be a Taoist.
We should actually stop there and just point out, like, where Zhang Daoling went to start in the 1st century CE was a multi-ethnic region where they spoke multiple different languages. Like, it really has from the beginning been multi-ethnic.
Right, exactly. I mean, I think this is a deeper insight that very few people would know, but the way it's gotten constructed, and even in modern mainland Chinese Taoism, I mean, the way that most, Han Chinese Taoists there construct Taoism is through this ethnocentric lens. So the only reason I'm saying all of this is because I think that there's starting to be other kinds of misconceptions from my perspective that sound more traditional or sound more authentic, but may be equally misleading and may be equally problematic, especially, and I've written about this pretty consistently, is when you look at things like Zhang Daoling, well, the source of the Celestial Masters is a revelation that was given to him. So he wasn't a Taoist, right?
Right, correct.
Wang Zhe, the source of his own experience was a set of mystical encounters. He wasn't a Taoist. So you have a fundamental problem with this kind of construction of Taoism, that to be a Taoist is to be an ordained priest or monastic. And it's like, but maybe arguably the two most important figures in organized Taoism weren't that, didn't have that.
No. And to be more accurate, actually, to what happened historically is that as people had these revelations, what we could call them revelations, whatever we want to call them, inspirations, Taoists in the Zhang Yi, to the degree that they were open, said, "Oh, we can maybe include you if you change a couple things." There was over the long period as those groups became more influential, those Taoists, spontaneous Taoists, maybe we should call them, that there was always a certain kind of openness that would allow them over generations to become part of something we might call a stream.
Yeah, and it's not to say that's not Taoism either. It's that is the institutional part. It's to say, I think we need to be more sophisticated and recognize this diversity and this complexity and how people have been positioned or located themselves. And this is a lot of people try to, want to talk to me about, are they Taoists or not? And I'm like, just forget this, right? This is like just a totally absurd. I mean, I understand it. Because it's like, well, we're not in China. Most of us aren't Chinese. So how do we fit? So I understand that. There's a kind of question of belonging. There's a question of like, am I really part of this? How do I kind of position myself and so on? So I understand all that. Like, that's a real thing. But beneath that, I think, is this question of, like I said, affinity and aspiration. And how have Taoists, like in this broad sense, been located or participated in this tradition? And that's very diverse, right? It's there's just a lot of different kinds of expressions. And so how do we kind of cultivate a connection? So obviously the primary Taoist concern is a connection with the Tao. That's what Taoism is, right? First and foremost. So one of the ways that I've tended to talk about it is it's concentric circles of how we're located.
Gong.
It depends, right? Yeah. So one part is there's the Tao, and you can say, but that's everyone, right? That's not specifically Taoist per se. But of course, it is a Taoist cosmological and theological concept. So, but then there's Taoism, right? So the tradition that claims to be emphasizing this kind of sacred connection or the sacred reality. Inside of that are these movements. Well, probably historically, the majority of Taoists weren't part of any movement either. right? And then inside of movements, there are these lineages, and most Taoists weren't inside of lineage either. So where are we located and why are we located that way, and does it matter? And I think this is really important for whoever is thinking about themselves as participating in the tradition is, yes, there is a question of connection, but how you have that connection or how you cultivate that connection is quite complicated and diverse. Right. So I just want to be clear, I think from my perspective, that is, even though whatever I have these things, right, I don't think people need those things.
Yeah. Okay. So this is the great thing about this is its openness. The problem with this conversation is its openness, right? That we can pin down, we just very accurately or quickly, but with, I think, some precision, sort of pin down some kind of historic movement, but we didn't really say what makes those people Taoist. And so then how do we transition to now saying, like, what makes a person Taoist? And both of us are already convinced that openness is the right approach, right? So that if somebody if a teenager shows up on your doorstep and says, I'm a Taoist, you're not going to contradict them, right? You're going to just hang out with them and have tea or whatever, like, see, but you still have your idea of what Taoism is. You're not like importing their idea in that sense. And same thing, if somebody's like, the Qigong teacher tells me they're a Taoist, I'm like, okay, maybe, do you want to hang out? Because, maybe we'll get closer, right? Like, but it isn't a conversion process. I think we would also agree that it isn't like we're holding on to what it is. We're not holding on tight. Yeah. So what is it?
What is Taoism?
Yeah, but we could, because when we do the openness thing, I think nobody can follow it. So what is it to you? And then we can back out to big or small if we want.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very complicated kind of question. I mean, for me, I think the first part is, Taoism is the tradition of the Tao. So from my perspective, it's theological. And what I mean by that is not God. I mean, there's something ultimately real. One of the radical things, like you said, sorry, I'm getting like,
go.
I'm getting
You're getting light.
Yeah, I don't know if that's helping you or not.
As long as you're comfortable. I'm getting a little hot.
I'm fine, but I can see the reflection. Anyway.
I'll just take my pants off. No,
so I think, one part of this is, that Taoists tend to emphasize this sacred connection. And one of the radical things is what you said about having a body affirming and world affirming view, which Taoism generally does, is we come into the world with this inherent original connection, and we can make that stronger. But I think one of the really radical, and this is kind of my, in a certain way, non-negotiables with Taoism is also an energetic tradition, right? And so this emphasis on qi, that I tend not to translate, but vital breath or energy or pneuma or however you want to translate it, is that there's this sacred presence. And Taoists say it's not all the same kind of qi. So there are particular kinds of qi. And one type of qi that Taoists tend to emphasize is Tao qi. So there actually is this all-pervading numinous presence that we can connect with, that we can cultivate. And that means it's not in my head. This is why I take so much issue with the construction of Taoism as philosophy, because it allows easy domestication. But it's like, but that's not what Taoism is. Taoism is not a thought. Taoism is a way of being in the world. And I think you can make this argument of other traditions too, but they might be more sympathetic to being appropriated as a conceptual, framework. Whereas Taoism is like, what are you talking about? Like the thing you said about the Zhuangzi, like what text are you reading that you think this is about disembodied ideas? So what I'm trying to get to
exactly,
with this, right, is that there's this element of Taoism that's like, okay, we believe, and not just believe, but we trust, we have an experience of this reality that's larger than ourselves. And what is the nature of that reality? And then we kind of say, this is how we understand it. And one way that we understand it is it's this all-pervading sacred presence that we cultivate and that we connect with. So therefore, and of course, this doesn't mean Taoists who don't do this aren't Taoists. I mean, it's like, I don't think many members of the Chinese Taoist Association have any clue about what I'm talking about, right? It's like what you said about secular materialism, that, I mean, if you're a secular materialist and you're a Taoist, right? Okay, you're ordained, you're in the institution, but what does this have to do with Taoism in a larger sense? And so adding these pieces, I think one part is that. So one part is this not just believing in the Tao, but that this is the nature of reality. And as you said, we can cultivate it in different ways where it becomes stronger. It becomes infusing our lives, right? It becomes more of the thing that's guiding us. And then when we take that, I think the other kind of key piece is this sacred orientation is part of being a Taoist, right? And I've said this repeatedly in public settings, is that I think one of the issues that's coming up, and it's not, I mean, it's coming from multiple directions, and we can also talk about the history of that, but we don't need to, which is, a lot of times it's being framed as functional. Being a Taoist is what you do, versus ontological. Being a Taoist is what you are. Right? And I've said this repeatedly as well. I don't think it's about being a Taoist. I think it's about Taoist being. Right? So when we connect that to some of the other parts of the conversation, there are these really deep Taoist principles. There's this deep Taoist wisdom and insight that's like, we're not telling you to believe this. We're saying these are the principles we've discovered that if you apply them, this is what you will find. They will actually transform.
Right? There's always an openness. There's always an openness.
But there's this possibility of energetic reconfiguration, transformation that leads to, okay, I did these practices, I had these types of experiences. Those experiences are actually confirming this view, and therefore, like, now I kind of actually feel connected to this tradition in a way, right? And that's, I think one thing that really has to be emphasized is that if we don't kind of recognize some of these essential principles or commitments, and then we just kind of frame it in these broad general ways, we miss it, because, right, it's like the Tao then can become what anybody wants it to be, and that one other thing I would say, and then, you could come in, is I think, this idea of the Tao being a universal concept, it's not, right? I mean, it is and it isn't, of course.
Right? I know, right? It's a problem, right?
Right. Taoists would be like, sure, yes, if you feel a connection with the Tao, or you resonate with the story that we're telling you about reality and the sacred, yes. But then there's this aspect of, you do realize Taoists were the ones who said the Tao is what's ultimately real. It's like, so when you invoke the Tao, you're invoking the Taoist tradition, right? On some level, you are. And so then, are you at least aware of that fact, rather than just going through this appropriative process of, okay, well, that fits into this and that fits into that. And that also relates to what you said about the Tao Te Ching. Well, you can read the Tao Te Ching however you want, but then there's this whole hermeneutical tradition in Taoism about, well, this is how He Shanggong read it. And a lot of Taoists said, oh yeah, we think He Shanggong's right. We're going to read it that way too. Well, that's a Taoist way of reading the Tao Te Ching. That's different than a kind of more conventional way of reading the Tao Te Ching or applying the Tao Te Ching. And the reason I'm saying all of that is it's not just the Tao, is that there are Taoist cosmological and theological views that accompany that kind of theological concept, that then it's like, well, what is it? And then Taoists will say, this is what we think it is. It's like, oh, but I really want it to be, my grandfather in the sky. It's like, it's not that. If you believe that, you're not a Taoist.
Yeah.
You're a monotheist, right? Or something, right? So what I'm trying to get to, right, is not it couldn't be that. I say this all the time when I speak about the Tao theologically. We're Taoist. So we have to say we don't know. We could be wrong. But the story we find most convincing And the story that we tell about the Tao from a Taoist perspective is this. So if you want to tell me what the Tao is from a Christian perspective, that's fine. But then you have to be ready for me to respond from a Taoist perspective, right? And that's what I'm trying to get to is, right, there, you start to layer these things on, and then people can figure out very quickly, like, just to finish this thought, one thing that always comes up for people is, when you cite the Tao Te Ching and you say, we're all straw dogs, then people are like, what? No, 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 I'm so important in the universe. It's like, okay, well, then you can opt out, right?
Yeah,
If,
yeah, you can opt out of being a Taoist and
yeah, you
decide
can
you're
opt out of
important.
being, look, if you
Yeah.
really want the universe to be like, Scott, you're just so important. I can't live without you. What are you doing now? Well, I'm doing this. Well, what are you going to do next? I'm going to do this. Oh, that's so great. I'm really supporting you, right? Like, no.
That's not
So,
Taoism. Yeah.
right. So it's not, so part of it is, that's not a problem. Like, that's one of, I think, the really amazing things about Taoism. Like you said, it's not a missionary religion. It's not interested in conversion. I mean, yes, at times Taoists engaged in, and now obviously in the modern world, that's a whole nother story. But there's this element of Taoism is like, and I've said this to people, it's like the amount of people I've convinced not to be Taoist is probably way more than the amount of people I've convinced. And I'm like, and they think I'm like, no, I actually did my job. Right? Like if I explained
Yeah.
it that well, and you're like, well, since you explained it that well, I realize I'm actually a Quaker. It's like perfect.
Yeah.
Well, aren't you upset about this? Why would I be upset? Like,
Yeah. No, it's a and oh, it's so interesting. I might as well say it. So I just recently, I doubt you read this essay, but it's possible. Sarah Allen, remember, wrote this book on water, the
yeah,
significance of water in Taoism, and I think that one thing that defines Taoism is these key metaphors and analogies of the
yeah,
nature of being, that we are like water, we seek the lowest of the low, and it's just simply a phenomenon. It's just a true thing. And so you can push against that, that general stream, but you're always going to end up somewhere where the water takes you. And there are also the idea that we have some kind of there's an innate quality to a baby, to an infant. There's quality that of a potentiality, which is it's not that Taoists worship that potentiality. It's that it's that the idea that that potentiality is self-arising and self and discoverable in across domains, in many different situations. Whatever you happen to, whether what you're doing is funny or extremely serious, whether it's dangerous or it's just casual, you can find that original nature, right? This is tricky language here, but that the baby-like quality of something that which which could be described as innocence, but is actually a kind of physicality, or a kind of, like, I like to say that what we call, not knowing is actually a physicality, and there is no method you can do. There's no, the Qigong doesn't make you not knowing, right? There's no method that produces not knowing. It's an actual, it's a value system about the relationship of what a human being is in the cosmos. And you can have a method, you do push hands to discover not knowing, but and it's brilliant. Push hands is brilliant. It explores the way in which we're triggered, to use a modern word, triggered by our hormonal system, or the sort of physiology of being. It explores it, right? But only if you have that view that you see your fundamental nature as embodying, as being, not knowing, and then the fruition could come out. But it's never the method, actually, or almost never. we might find an exception, but and this is probably the biggest error that people who think they're Taoists make, is that they think they're Daoist because they do a method, because they're practicing the golden elixir as it was taught to them, for instance. And one thing that I really think helps, we've talked a little bit about translation and the source text, which matters, but cultural context also matters. And I was at one of these Daoist conferences, and there was this presentation on there's this really huge translation of a golden elixir teacher. I'm not gonna say who it was. And all his disciples were all there, and they were talking about the two methods of practice. One, like the higher level one, where you discover it yourself, completely self-arising. And the other one where the teacher gives it to you. And they were all, because of our, our birth problem, we're all doing the one where the teacher gives it to you. And I was like, so the problem here is that if you were familiar with Chinese literature at the level of a Chinese peasant for the last 500 years, like the base level, you would know that someone who gives you the golden elixir thinks you're a demon and they're trying to control you. Now, that may not be true of your teacher. It may or may not be true, but that's the story. Like, that's the story everyone would know. And you don't seem to know it. So the cultural context ends up being very important in this kind of process, especially when we engage with things that are almost always considered Daoist methods, like the golden elixir.
Well, and the cultural context, I think, is problematic on our side, which is the way that Taoism has been constructed and appropriated has led to a whole set of distortions, where it's like, if you're actually talking about something like tradition-based Taoism, or whatever we want to talk about, like having integrity or authenticity or whatever it happens to be, whatever that helpful category is, then it's like, well, this isn't Taoism, because this is all the rest of it. It's like, right, all the rest of it's nonsense, right? So
right, that claim, right?
The unlearning part, right? Like, set aside all of that, and start with the inquiry of what is it? How do you find a connection with it? And that's why I use translation as an example so much, because are you actually reading a translation? And if you are reading a translation, does that person have the skill set, the training, the motivation to give you something that's a closer approximation to the original? So of course that starts to get problematic, because you're like, well, what's the original Taoism? That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that there's some kind of source, right? And Taoism uses that language. There's the Taoist source, and then there's the external three treasures of the Tao, the scriptures, and the teachers. So do we have access to the Jing? Do we have access to the scriptures? Are the teachers connected to the Tao and the scriptures? What's the relationship of these things? Does the teacher remember that they're a third? No, most of the time not. Most of the time they replace one. And you're like, or there's no two, there are no scriptures, or scriptures are irrelevant. It's like, okay, but according to whom? And I think, going back to what you brought up, it's like one part where I think the movements or the lineages actually are helpful, not like become a member of Trengen, not that, but like, if you are a Trengen Taoist, what text do you read and why? And why is that different than other, sub-traditions or other movements? And then someone can say, oh yeah, I find the Qing Jing Jing, the scripture on clarity and stillness, really interesting and really helpful. It's like, so do Trengen Taoists, and other people be like, I have no idea what this text is about. It's like, good, then, don't be a Trengen Taoist, or don't talk to Trengen Taoists, because they're gonna, if they're really rooted in the scriptural foundations, they're going to keep bringing up these kinds of texts. So, I think one part of it is like, if we're in this context, how is it, that when you do these searches on Taoism, really what you get is nonsense, And then it's like, well, we can talk about that. Like, we've touched upon a bunch of things like the YMCA education system, or whatever it happens to be, the communist state, or, on and on and on. But then why are we engaging Taoism the way that we are? Are we engaging, and this is one of the ways I tend to think about it, are we like engaging it on its own terms? Do we have access to reliable sources that help us engage it on its own terms? And then do we actually have an affinity, with this? Do we feel a resonance with the teachings or the practices or whatever they happen to be? And a lot of people obviously do. But that, and I want to go back, because one thing I did not say, which I think is actually important, is I personally think of Taoism as a system of transformation, right? And so one of the issues I have, and I don't, I joked, when I left mainstream academia, it's like, good, now I'm out of the rectification business.
Yeah.
And I really feel that way. It's like, I'm just not interested. I'm just not interested in rectifying it anymore, right? It's like, if you want to be informed, be informed. If you don't want to be informed, don't be informed. It's like, that's not my concern. But I do think there's this element that's being lost of, there's actually something vitally important in this process of globalization, of, dissemination, of engagement, even at what you said, even if we want to think about it in those terms of like improvisation, which is that kind of core orientation, is that core kind of commitment or approach being re-embodied or remembered in the process. And I think one part of it is that it really is about a kind of energetic way of being in the world that has this set of qualities, right? And this is why you get things like in the Tao Te Ching where it says, because they could not be recognized, we feel compelled to describe their qualities. And you're like, what? Because
they're like crossing a river in the middle of winter.
Yeah, but also like, well, if they couldn't be recognized, how can you describe them? And it's like, because we're Taoists. Taoists recognize Taoists, and they're like, these are the qualities. So are you cultivating those qualities? Are you embodying those qualities? Are those qualities familiar to you? And along with that, I think there's a way to kind of frame our practice as cultivation, embodiment, and transmission. So not everyone is doing 3, not everyone needs to do 3, but we need some people who can do 3. At least all Taoists are doing 1 and 2, which is
what was it? What 1, 2,
cultivation, embodiment, and transmission. Right? So that's just obvious. I mean, Taoists always talk about show Tao, cultivating the Tao. So it's obvious that there's some set of principles or practices or approaches that are about like actively, intentionally cultivating the Tao, cultivating this sacred connection. But then embodiment, which is what you brought up, right? Like, how are we actually literally remembering this in the world? And, one of my kind of pet theories about religion is that different religious traditions become embodied in different ways in the world, including specific movement patterns. And so Taoists tend to have very recognizable kinds of qualities of movement. And when you are a Taoist and you've cultivated this and you're around Taoists, you're like, yeah, I mean, we're not Catholics. Catholics don't move this way, right? We're not Theravada Buddhists. I mean, this is one of the crazy things, right? When you talk to people about movement, like walking meditation, they're like, yeah, I do walking meditation. It's like, we're not talking about Vipassana walking meditation, right? So
we're not.
Right? No. Yeah, there are other kinds of like movement awareness practices and so on. And the reason I'm bringing all that up is that then it's like, how is it actually becoming manifest through me as this embodied being in the world? And then, yes, ideally, there would be at least some people who are transmitting it, who actively, intentionally are saying, it's not just about my own cultivation. It's not just about me embodying it in the world. It's me trying to help you find your own connection, find your own cultivation, find your own embodiment. So I think these kinds of things I would add, right, to all of this, which is when we kind of think about the fact that we're in these different contexts, we have these different influences. I would say, when I used to teach like this, I would say, well, yeah, global Taoism is real. And then I'd say, do I need to make a stronger argument? Meaning, I'm standing in front of you, some weird white guy that was born in Detroit, Michigan. Like you either deny my identity, which is fine, or you don't, and you go, oh my God, you're right. Now what do I do? Because I at least have to put this one weird white guy who was born in Detroit and grew up in Northern California in my interpretive framework. However you do it is fine. And obviously, I'm just using myself as an example. I mean, it's like you could bring in this insanely complex, multicultural, multi-ethnic group of people now who are Taoists from all different backgrounds, and then say, okay, well, global Taoism is a fact. So now we've got this question of how does global Taoism connect to Chinese Taoism as the source tradition? Is that a question or a concern that matters to us personally, or does it not? How is it going to become something like a more intentional kind of global community and these kinds of things? I mean, those are complex questions, right? But for me, that's how I see my own relationship to it and my own place in it, which is, even though sometimes I think I can sound sectarian, I'm not sectarian. I could care less. I'm trying to say, like, there's an actual question of connection. That's it. And that connection matters. Not like, oh, who's the real Taoist? It's like, no, there's something actually theologically significant here.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. I mean, it's stuck around, for a long time. And within Taoism, there is a clear doctrine of what happens when it gets lost and how it comes
exactly.
back, right? And so no, that's great. That and that question of transmission is it's big. I mean, I'm teaching the Tao Te Ching. I fell into translation, into studying classical Chinese so that I could translate, because I was just using a lot of other people's translations and commentaries initially, and then I would just find these conflicts, and I'm like, well, the only way I can either get a better commentary, or I can get better into the text, or get better into reading the commentaries. And it's continuously refreshing. I actually started to say something before, and then I got sidetracked, which was about Sarah Allen, new works, all this stuff on Chinese medicine and all the tombs. There's so much stuff coming out, but she was specifically talking about the oldest version we know of the Tao Te Ching, which is just a partial or 3 partial texts called the Guodian texts. And she's argues in this essay. Did you by any chance read this essay?
I'm not sure. What is it? Is it a recent essay?
Yeah, it's really
Yeah,
recent.
maybe not.
Yeah, it's like last year or something.
Okay.
And she argues that the third of these 3, which again are partial, and they're really, by the way, the old stuff's really interesting. I might say, for instance, there's a term used in Taoism a lot, Ming, which is also the name of the Ming dynasty, like the sun and moon together, brightness, illumination. And in the older texts, it's kind of a negative. It's got a little bit of a negative tendency. It's not, it's like because there's an emphasis on the dark. And so it's very interesting to sort of see how that may be changed by the time this Tao Te Ching was solidified. But what I wanted to say, she posits this theory that there's the third of these three Tao Te Ching texts they're all embedded in longer texts. So it hasn't been defined yet. And the text that precedes the Tao Te Ching section as being part of an older text is what she argues, that it was continuous. So it's like a lost Tao Te Ching section or something. But she also explains why it was lost, in a sense, by saying that she posits, she has this whole thing about water being a central metaphor, and she does this amazingly interesting commentary on the Tao Te Ching I hadn't heard before. You probably know the chapter to be preserved, whole, bend upright, then twisted, to be full, hollow out. What's worn out will be repaired. Those who have much to be gained, much you only be perplexed. Hold to the one like a model or a shepherd, and the term is shi, and be a guide to all under heaven. It's the text. That term actually refers to something called a cosmograph, which was a kind of tool that was used for keeping, as a kind of calendar tool. It looks a little bit like the feng shui compass, but it turned. and it had the North Star at the center. And she argues that throughout the Tao Te Ching, there's the use of the word great, Tai, or Da, and the term one, and that there was actually a taboo in the Tao Te Ching against saying Tai I, or the great one, which was in fact in some previous version of the country of Chu, where Lao Tzu supposedly came from, in the southern part of the Chinese era, in this, say, 300, it was a whole country in, say, 350 BCE, was they had an older religion which was built around the cosmology of the Big Dip, the Milky Way, which was a river of stars, right? A river of stars, water, coming out of the North Star, being born of the North Star. And that on this cosmograph, you were able to track the calendar via the edges of the Milky Way. It was really obvious where the solstices were if you lined it up with this device. But then what happened over maybe 1,000 years is it shifted slightly. And so it wasn't quite right anymore. And so it became a metaphor analogy in this new religion. Anyway, fascinating theory about the language of the Tao Te Ching. And it's sort of what I'm saying is, like, when you dive in, you get so much back out. So the hold to the one actually means, and this is, I think, this transmitted clearly through the Daoist tradition, but it's so clear when you see it this way. Hold to the one means the outside of time, right, of the North Star, that it's just there, and inside of time, inside of a massive scope of change and time beyond comprehension, simultaneously, is what hold to the one means. Anyway, I thought that was be like this device is to all under heaven. Anyway, and I just sort of did that because to give people an idea of what it means for me to access the Daoist tradition. It's one example, because that's an actual practice, right? It's actually describing a type of embodiment. And what I just did there was a type of transmission. I don't know if anybody's listening, but presumably it could, right? It's like those three things are there. I have another question for you.
Yeah.
And it's by way of, it's a commentary on what you said about the universal, right? It's sort of like, where are we in the universal? And in the Chuangzi, oh no, is it Chuangzi? Sorry, it's in the Late. In the Late, it might be a little bit in the outer chapters of Chuangzi too. There's this guy named Yang Chu, who he's like as there isn't a lot that he wrote. I don't know. There's things attributed to him, and there's not a lot. But he, the philosophical people have tended to call him a hedonist, which doesn't work. Right. And he has this line. It's like somebody asked him, would you sacrifice your life to save the whole world? And he's like, no. And they, well, would you sacrifice an arm to save the whole world? It's like, it's really not my plan. No, sorry, not interested. And then, well, would you sacrifice a finger to save the whole world? And Yangju said, I wouldn't even sacrifice a fingernail clipping. Like, sorry, that's just not my thing, basically. And they call him a hedonist or something like this, into his own pleasure. I'm just like, no, he's actually making a statement about the nature of reality. Sacrifice doesn't save the whole world, right? But I the world that we live in, the contemporary American world, like in politics and in health practices and in the religious cosmologies that people live with, I constantly hear references to what people feel they are sacrificing in order to achieve something. And the Taoist framing just like melts that. Like, so what are you actually doing? You know, because I'm not buying this sacrifice connection thing here, but it's so deep in our language too. Like it's like the fundamental, like what marriage is a sacrifice or something, you know, even the word, you know, to say it's a sacred, you said earlier, it's a sacred, Daoism is a sacred orientation. Yeah, it's a sacred orientation without a sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You want to comment on that? As a,
The
any
sacrifice
of it,
part. Oh,
any
any
of
of
it.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, Yang Zhu is a very complicated figure, like you said, because we're not quite sure what he taught. So is it just these are people telling us what they want us to believe he taught so that we don't like him or we do like him or whatever? Yeah, I mean, I think a more neutral kind of translation of the Yangists, right, is the individualists, right? That they're basically saying, self-cultivation is the primary thing. And then you can add other elements. I mean, one part I think we run into not just with um, classical Taoism, but Taoism as a whole, which we've been exploring a little bit, is it's a multivocal tradition. So, of course, at times somebody wants to claim they're in charge, and it's like, I'm the celestial master, I'm in charge, and all the other Taoists like laugh at them, right? Except for the celestial masters, right?
Yeah.
And that's why I bring this up all the time. There's not one reference to any Zhang family member in Shenzhen.
Of course.
There's not one reference to Tian Shi Dao or Zheng Yi Dao or anything in early Shenzhen. So these Taoists were clearly like, who are you people? Right? So it's just interesting. Like, it doesn't mean, oh, therefore Shenzhen should be privileged. It means they didn't recognize that as important. They were like, we're interested in the Dao De Jing, we're interested in the Yin Fu Jing, we're interested in the Qing Jing Jing, on and on and on. So, it's like it resets our framework to think like even the whole thing about searching for, Lao Tzu or even Zhang Dao Ling, it's like, yeah, you're searching for a phantom. This is like a composite. These are multiple voices being put into one text where you go, oh, it totally changes the text when I do that, where I'm not trying to figure out why is it inconsistent. Yeah, it's inconsistent because it's different people talking about different things, or whatever it happens to be. So what I'm trying to get to is one part is the multivocal part.
Yeah.
Which is, okay, here's this one. And that's why I like the Zhuangzi so much, because in the Zhuangzi, it's just clear. It's like, here's this one, community elder, and this is what he's teaching. And then there's this other community elder, and this is what they're teaching. And then it's like, okay, well, how do those fit together? I think it's like, well, are you their student? Are you part of their community? Because if you aren't, then maybe you don't understand what it is they're trying to communicate, or maybe they have a very idiosyncratic understanding of something that you have to go, but does that relate to this? Yeah, it does relate to that, but it's nuanced. It's their own explanation or account of that. So I think that's, one part. Another part, yeah, I mean, I think this is why I brought up the thing that I did about people saying, I'm a Taoist because I believe in the Tao. It's like, but what's your actual theology that you're using to understand it? Because more often than not, it's a Christian theology in the West, or it's at least a monotheistic theology, and Taoists aren't monotheists. So, right, and it's just what you said about the mountain gods or whatever, the blood sacrifice stuff. It's like, you don't want us to tell you the story about monotheism because you're not going to like it, because it's a polytheistic story about monotheists who've convinced you that monotheism is true. And then you're like, but that's not even the story of monotheism. If you read the Hebrew Bible carefully, that's clearly not what it is. So when you get into this level, it's like, okay, well, there's that. There's this is how I'm orienting myself in my life. This is what I'm doing. But it's like all of that is being infused by certain kinds of commitments, certain values. And are you aware of them? And to me, that's the authentic part, right? It's not, are you an authentic Taoist? It's like, are you living your life authentically? Like, have you figured out what you actually think is important? You know, are you trying your best to follow those principles? Are you doing your best, quote unquote, to like embody that in the world? And if we're using that as a framework, to transmit something. And in this case, it would be Taoist. So, you know, that, and, but it doesn't, it can be broadened, like you said about the universal, it can be broadened to say, we're not saying, of course, as Taoists, we tend to cultivate these kinds of things. But we're saying, do you actually know what you're cultivating? Because we don't think
Yes.
you do.
Yes.
Like, right? Like that's the framework. It's like when
Right.
you look around, it's like, oh yeah, this is what I'm cultivating. It's like, you know, you're actually cultivating the exact opposite, right? And that's where I think the energetic framework comes in. It's like we're not listening to the rhetoric. We're not listening to the campaign promises. We're not listening to the kind of rhetorical construct. We're like, it's so obvious this is not what you're doing, you know?
Right.
So that part, and then I think on specifically the sacrifice part, it's yeah, like all these stories that have become the dominant stories of what we're doing in our lives, you know, instead of, you know, when you, and that's why I think the kind of the whatever you want to call it, like there's a certain kind of practice that's being emphasized or advocated that says, if you trust us just at the beginning, just trust us that this is going to do something that's beneficial, and then you do it, it starts to kind of deepen that connection. So then it's kind of clear, and I always say this to people about social engagement. It's like you have no idea why you're doing what you're doing, you know, or you have no idea what it's going to actually do because you haven't done the inner work to figure that out. And this is, I think, really saying the inner work is the beginning. And when you do that, it becomes clear. So maybe you will sacrifice yourself, but you're not going to sacrifice yourself because somebody's trying to convince you that you should sacrifice yourself. That's what, right? Like so many of these dialogues in the Zhuangzi is saying, like the one where, you know, he says, is it possible to be emotionless? Yes. Well, if you're emotionless, you're not human. Well, that's not what I mean by being emotionless. I mean, I'm not crazy like you people.
Yeah, right.
Right? Like I've done contemplative practice to the point where I've settled that hyper emotionality, all that reactivity, all of those conceptualizations of it to go like, it's just a kind of simple responsiveness, you know? And then have you done that? If you do that, maybe you find yourself in a situation where you're like, oh yeah, I'm going to sacrifice myself. Not because you went, I should sacrifice myself, right? So there's this Taoist element, which is don't buy the kind of external imposition of these narrative frameworks on your life and these demands for who you're supposed to be. Is like, do you have clarity of perception where it's the actual, and that goes back to the earlier part, like an authentic expression of who you are and your connection with the Tao. That could be social activism. That could be like, I'm going to the hills. I have nothing to do with this. I'm going to wait it out, you know? And I think that's one of the brilliant things of Taoism, that recognition of you don't actually know what somebody's duh is. You can say, right, inner power or virtue. You can say, these are the qualities that are recognizable to us as general patterns of duh in the world. But that particular person's duh is their duh. They've found their connection to the Tao, and this is, and it's like going back to some of the things you brought up, like they've just, martial arts is what they're cultivating, right? Or meditation is what they're cultivating, or whatever it happens to be. But through that particular discipline or approach, then this connection with the Tao is ideally kind of manifesting. So that's part of what I think too, is it's like that goes back to the unlearning or the non-knowing, which is, oh, I've been told, and that again, if we think about the Trenjen point that I made earlier, it's like, I've been told if I don't have children, my life is meaningless. Well, that's nonsense.
Yeah, right.
And it's like, well, everybody believes it. I know they believe it. There's a reason they believe it. It's called social reproduction. So like, I'm not saying don't have children, right? Which is what like people
But you're
think
saying
I'd
see
say.
it. You're saying see it, right?
Yeah, I'm saying see it, and I'm saying, did you make a conscious, intentional choice, whatever it happens to be? And is that the choice you want to make? And is that choice, and if we're using the Taoist lens, is it theologically infused, you know, with the sacred connection?
Right. So both of us are familiar. You haven't used it much with the ghost framing, right? And that the idea that that we have all these influences, right, on us all the time. Like what you do might not be you, right? And
Right.
right, it might be an ancestor coming through. My ancestors are in my books, and they're like, they keep looming down and saying, you should read more, or whatever it is they're saying. And that and then there are these other kinds of more ghostly, wandering type of demonic forces which possess people. And again, another Taoist framing is just to see, the entirety of social media as a kind of, morass of people being possessed, right? But it's not telling you not to go on Facebook. I'm not saying that, right? I'm just, can you see the way in which people are possessed? You can't be right and they can't be wrong, like stuck in some kind of like weak, extremely weak, like voice, sort of in the Taoist framing, trying to be reborn, but it doesn't have enough chi, right? And you show up with chi, if you can, not maybe in social media, but, and things settle, right? And things resolve
Well, and I think
of
that's
themselves.
right. And that's part of, I think, the fundamental, Taoist view or approach, which is that Tao Chi is not in that, right? So even if you want to go to a kind of level down and say Gen Chi, true Chi, real energy isn't in that, right? And it's like, how do you know that? Because the connection isn't there, right? It's not sustainable. I mean, this is why there's so many of these people who need like tens of thousands of followers. It's like, that's called deficient chi,
And SSRIs too.
or whatever happens to be. I mean, it's just endless. But I
Yeah.
think that, the Taoist thing is, well, do you actually have this connection? And do you see that that connection is an energetic support that's not your own, that's beyond you? It doesn't matter then. It's like this is also, I mean, if we're talking about in a certain way how Taoism, I think, is endangered, but also maybe represents like a antidote to some of these things, is one of the key concepts, like in the Tao Te Ching is Wu Ming, namelessness. Well, part of your Ming isn't just the name that you were given from your parents, which of course it's also your social identity. And Taoists are like, if, and in the Zhuangzi it says, fame is a public weapon.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
or fame and disgrace are like being startled in the Tao Te Ching. They're like,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, we're describing to you energetically, if you focus on the false identity that you've made and that's been made of you, you won't be able to listen to this deeper energetic presence in the world and in your life. And what we really want, right, is not that, because that's the critique. What we
Right.
really want is more people to say, oh, is that possible? Yeah, it's possible.
So what you just laid out is the pretty precisely the view, which I say is the ground for Daoyin or
Mhm.
Daoyin, right? That the cultivation of the body specifically, and I don't even use the word qigong anymore, by the way. But when I'm really talking about kind of circus quality of Daoyin, that what infiltrated the Chinese theater, and that these people were not Taoists; they were just Taoists, of the people in the theater that were practicing Daoyin and made it their life. They were embodying it for the whole civilization, going around, doing theater. Um, they were doing a Daoyin practice with that. If they have that framing, it's Taoist, right? And what sometimes I describe it as the practice, the experimental practice of separating your body from your story, so
Mhm.
that the story being your fame and disgrace, perhaps, and the body being something very real.
And
Quote
also,
the
I
Tao Te
think,
Ching, right?
and also what you're describing, which is like, what are you saying yes to? What are you involved in? And that from a Taoist perspective, it's all energetic, right? So by choosing to be part of that, whatever social media world, you're
Mm,
actually
mm,
choosing to
mm,
participate in a different kind of energetic landscape than
right.
the energetic landscape that Taoists are interested in. That doesn't mean they're not reconcilable or they're not compatible. They could be. I don't think they actually are, right? But that's my view.
Well,
But
let me stop you for a second. But the sort of point about what I might call Daoyin extremism, right, is that what I've cultivated, because, you know, I started out doing martial arts, but as a dancer and as an improviser, I already had a certain amount of Taoist framing, right? Like it's fundamentally, dance is fundamentally about transformation. You are changing your body. It's a tool for that. What dance, you know, dance is, so it's for merging with phenomena, maybe not all the Tao, but you're merging with phenomena. It's what is the dance to music, right? And that Dao Yin, one type of fruition is extraordinary expression that's not possessed, right? That's not driven by some kind of compulsion, right? But that you have the range of physicality. And this, of course, could, because people may be more familiar with the social realm, you know, you could say the same thing in there, you know. So you could, what would it be to be Tao? I don't even want to go there, but what would it be to be Taoist on social media, right? Which way are you facing, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the kind of, you know, going in a certain way back to the core of this conversation, even though it's been wide ranging, is the kind of question of global Taoism. And I don't mean that in some kind of constructed way. I mean in the sense of like a real living, lived community. Is, I think one part is it's embodied. Right? So it's like, well, that's starting to disappear, right? One part of it is place specific. Well, that's starting to disappear, right? One part of it is actually like a unique aesthetic experience. And it's like, well, that's largely disappearing. So if you start to put those pieces together and you say, yeah, I mean, global Taoism is also what's happening on the internet. Yes. But like, where is the kind of tradition being cultivated and embodied in the world?
Yeah.
If what we're really talking about, and it's ironic we're doing this right this way.
No, but it's unavoidable that we would.
But it's unavoidable
irony.
if we're going to have this particular conversation and maybe welcome other people in the conversation. But what I'm saying is, if you then say, oh, what would it be like to be an embodied Taoist in community, in place, with Taoist aesthetics, I think you're getting closer to the actual taste of Taoism as a living and a lived tradition that you participate in, that you become like a member of, literally, right, in that process of participation and cultivation. And that's what interests me. You know, this is why I said, like, I'm partly out of the rectification business. I have very little interest in social media, but I am really interested in the possibility of being with other Taoists in community, in place, you know. And I think that's something that maybe, you know, is contribution that Taoism can make to the modern world, is to remind people, you know, you're not this digital identity. You're not, what you are is this actual organic being in the world that has this sacred connection. And that sacred connection, that energy, is infusing everything. And there's a way to cultivate that sensitivity and have that deeper connection, and then be with other people in relationship in that same way. And that's what really interests me, right, about this, is not all the like lineage and ordination and, you know, who says what and how do you fit into the institution. It's is it possible to be a different kind of being in the world with, and I don't even think it's human. You know, my view of Taoism is it's actually transhuman. It's more about shared animality, which takes us into a whole nother conversation about
animism,
animals,
yeah,
and all kinds of things, right? Like actual organic, you know, embodied other quote unquote non-human animals in the world. And there's a lot of that in the Zhuangzi too. You just have to read it carefully. And so part of this is to say, like, that vision of Taoist place, that vision of Taoist community is not just human, right? It's a kind of inclusive community that's more than human, that says,
it's a really important point.
But you know, like, then if we say, oh, all right, there are these elements of being Taoist, or, you know, being in the tradition that's communal, that's geographical, that's animalic, on and on, you start to layer on other possibilities that I think is largely being lost. Like, oh, well, here's this book on Qigong techniques. It's like, okay, so that's like a fragment of something. It doesn't mean it doesn't have a connection. It doesn't mean it's not helpful. But then it's like, but where's all the rest of it? You know?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it's like, Christopher Schipper's idea of like the Taoist body, right? As not just like my body or your body, but like thinking about community and tradition as the body. It's like, well, what kind of body are we in if we only have that one organ functioning that way? It's like we're not in a body. We need all the organs functioning together.
Okay, so that leads to another really big question. So you brought up aesthetics, right? And I live in a fashion desert out here in Colorado. Like nobody, like it's just so bad, like and if you care about fashion, there's like only 3 people that you can talk to, or something like that. And uh and and culture, right? To me, part of what I think is intrinsic to the transmission that's important to me, is it Taoism or not? It's a side issue, but to me, in part of my transmission is somehow connecting people with what culture is. And one of the major characteristics of the civilization I was born into is the centrality of morality, as an organizational tool. And to contrast it with Japan, aesthetics are like higher than morality in Japanese culture. At least they appear to be. There's a question about whether you can understand another culture, in fact. But and so this idea, like, and by the way, I'm going to Ghana in July because I'm really interested in African dance, and I have made all sorts of connections between the African animism and its migration into the modern world, and the relationship of my own practice through Daoism and what Daoism says about the African traditions, and it's seeing the body as energetic, for instance. The parallels, the similarities, the communication between aesthetics and culture are really interesting to me and fulfilling, right? And I don't know where it's going. I really don't know where it's going, but it seems worth doing. Like, I'm a person who can make that translation, and I want to do it. And so I'm wondering about, since we're talking about global Taoism, if you have thoughts about Taoism in other cultures, or what does Taoism, that's one question, Taoism in beyond China. And the other question is, does Taoism give us some way of connecting to other cultures? And I'm particularly interested in this idea of a Taoist aesthetic.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing the way I view it is, first and foremost, it's like when you think about Taoism historically, it's a counterculture, right? And it's underground, like a spiritual underground. If you kind of look at probably how few Taoists there actually have been throughout human history and how they were located. I mean, sometimes they ascended up. Obviously, we know this, like in the Tang Dynasty or something. It's like, good job by you guys. You got a lot of infrastructure. I hope it worked out. But more often than not, it was like they're just trying to figure out how to fit right into or avoid this, like the dominant culture. And I think they were trying to preserve this particular kind of story or approach. So there's a way to think of it that way. And then, of course, in modern Taoism, Taoists will talk about Dao Jiao Wan Hua, Taoist culture. And at first, when I was, in China and I kept hearing this, I was like, oh, this is a way to avoid the Zongjiao category, the religion category, right? You just say it's culture. And at first, and I think there is an element where it is that, right? It's like, it's better to be a culture than to be a religion. But then I started to realize, no, that's not what they're talking about, because they're not really using it that much outside of Taoism. They're using it more inside of Taoism, of kind of reminding each other, like, we have our own culture, you know? So we're part, in this case, because it's in mainland China, we're part of Chinese culture, yes. And we're part of Chinese history. And of course, this is my pushback on a lot of the sinologists is, yes, but there's something distinctively Taoist going on. And there's an overlap, there's an intersection. So one thing I think that comes up for me is there's Taoist culture. So that's some of the things we already talked about. There's a particular history. There's specific figures and what they represent. There's specific texts, right? And they're texts that almost no one else reads except for Taoists, right? And on and on and on. But then there's like art, right? And material culture and all of these kinds of things. And when you spend time in a living Taoist monastery or temple, you see all of this. So you see the way that your life isn't just kind of fragmented into, I'm a Taoist inside my own mind, you know, or even I'm a Taoist inside my own body. It's also, I'm a Taoist in relational spatiality with all of these other things infusing my life and my practice, you know, so that can be art, calligraphy, whatever, ritual performance, ritual implements, you know, on and on and on. It's like, it doesn't really matter in that sense, but I think it does matter when you start to imagine place-specific community as the kind of framework of, okay, well, what am I surrounded by? You know, what am I reading? You know, what other kind of cultural influences do I have? So, you know, that's one piece I think is really important, is the way in which, if we are going to talk about Taoism as an embodied and kind of lived and maybe even place-specific kind of tradition, and I don't mean place-specific like you have to go to China, but you go, well, is the place where I live nourishing my practice? Am I really connected to it? Is there some other larger circulation pattern going on? But also the way in which like that actually becomes, you know, part of practice. It informs practice. So if we do this intentionally, then there's this possibility of our practice becoming deeper through the materiality of it all, you know, through the aesthetics of it. Then I think I'll just say one more piece about this before I answer the second part of the question, which is what I think is also important is it's not just like uncritically accepting, oh, but you know, this is Chinese architecture. So like, let's build a giant Chinese temple out in the middle of Nebraska. It's like, why? Like, where are the materials coming from? Is that really Taoist? Or is it your own kind of weird idea of what Taoism is being superimposed on a new culture and a new landscape instead of, and this is, I think, the key point is there are these principles and there are these values. And if we can identify them, we can apply them. You know, so I think about this a lot in terms of things like feng shui, but more like spatiality in general. There's a very particular kind of Taoist spatiality that we can apply to any structure. Doesn't matter where we live. We can kind of bring that spatial sense, that aesthetic sense, and maybe even design, this is one of my own projects, you know, maybe even design a new form of Taoist architecture where people go, oh, whoa, that's Taoist. It's like, but it doesn't look like it's supposed to look. It's like, right, that's because you're getting attached to appearances. This is about the actual energetic reality of it, the kind of framework it's creating, the space that's being activated. So I think we can do that. There are a number of artists that I'm working with, trying to help them think through these questions of, you know, well, what is,
me too.
What are some, yeah, what are some of the principles? You know,
Yeah,
and how can I do this differently where I don't just become attached to, well, I should do calligraphy because that's how it's been done in China or whatever. So I think all of these kinds of things are part of the globalization of respect for tradition, recognition of the tradition, a kind of familiarity with it, and ideally like a deeper engagement with it, but then also not an uncritical acceptance of it. For instance, like sinocentrism. I mean, it's like, yeah, I mean, China is not the center of my universe and it's not going to be. I'm not interested, right? Or being Chinese in that narrow sense is not kind of my fundamental concern, but that there's a recognition of, yes, but there's a source tradition there. So how are we connected to or informed by that source tradition? The second thing I'd say to and answer the second part, I think, yeah, I mean, one of the things I really, you know, like and respect about Taoism, I mean, part of the reason I think I am a Taoist is that openness and that kind of, you know, receptivity to something else and the willingness to kind of not superimpose one's own conceptual framework onto other cultures. So if we come to it from a Taoist perspective, I think one is being able to recognize certain kinds of overlaps or connections, right, or parallels that that we can then engage with these other principles, you know. And one is clearly like a number of people I've been talking to. It's like this cross culture, this question of like the kind of cross cultural phenomenon of qi, you know. And then it's like, okay, well, what is the correlate in these other cultures? And then you start to gather this repertoire of technical terms, and then you say, and I was having this conversation with someone from Tahiti, and they were saying mana, you know, and it's like, I don't know, you know, and it's
Into
like,
in Bantu.
right,
Yeah.
and it's like, well, is that chi? And then the way she was talking about, I'm like, that sounds more like duh, that sounds more like inner power virtue. And then it's like, no, maybe it's the fusion of both. It's like, well, that's interesting. I mean, because I think there is a way to connect duh to chi, you know, to energy or vital breath or
Sure.
whatever you want to translate it
Yeah.
in Taoism too. But then how is that culture framing it? And how do they cultivate it? And then how does it manifest, right? And sometimes I've only done a little bit, I'm much more on the kind of inner cultivation side of it all. But one thing, you know, that I've seen, I think pretty repeatedly, especially in indigenous cultures, is that tends to be more like Ling, right? Like numinosity or efficacy in traditional Chinese culture, where it's not just kind of like charisma or energetic presence. It's also, you have some kind of power to change things, right?
Right. And there's some empowered substance, right?
Right.
Ling is associated often like with like hair or something, or yeah.
Yeah, and so I think the kind of, you know, classical foundational view is if that happens, it happens naturally, and it's not yours, and it's not there for you to use for these kinds of intentional purposes, right? Whereas in other cultures, a lot of times it's like, well, that's what makes that guy powerful. Like,
Mhm.
if you do something, this is what's going to happen to you, so don't do something. It's like, oh, and Taoists are like, no, no, we're not in the business of injuring people energetically or manipulating people energetically.
But I would argue that who wrote this? I think it was Mark Muhlenbelt, has an essay where he talks. I wish I actually had it in front of me, but where he talks about Lao Tzu's younger sister, a daughter, Lao Tzu's daughter Gigi, and Gigi marries this shaman, and there's this whole thing in Hunan, is like he gets, Lao Tzu tries to kill him, and then but his Gigi reassembles him, but puts his head underneath. So he's like, the way this god moves is by doing like flip-flops kind of thing, headstand flips. And there's a whole culture constructed around that. And they actually, and so there's this term fa shi, right? That parallels Dao shi, right? So the Taoist priest and then the ritual master or something. But for a while, people were translating fa shi because fa is the character used for Buddhism. So they were translating it as Buddhist when they just saw the text. But then we actually found more evidence of these communities and talking to people like, oh, no. A fa shi is like a non-Taoist Taoist, like someone who does this stuff, just like you were saying, is actually using the methods for something that are anti-Taoism. But Taoism didn't separate itself from that entirely. It was sort of like, well, that's my daughter who married this guy I didn't really like, but we still talk, kind of relationship.
Yeah, and this goes back to, I think, the earlier part of the conversation, which I'm not saying, well, there are kind of layers of reality, and what layer of reality are we connected with, and what layer of reality are we interested in being aligned with, right? And so this, again, this is my own particular view. I mean, people don't have to accept it, but I'm much more on the apophatic side of Taoism. I'm on that non-differentiated side, the formless side of Taoism, where I think it's like, okay, yes, we are embodied in the world, we're differentiated, we're forms in the world, but how do we negotiate that? How do we negotiate the relationship between the Tao as non-differentiation and our own participation in the Tao as this differentiated reality? And I think that if from this perspective, it's like trying to maintain that connection through all of those relationships and all those interactions. And is there a way to be more aligned with the Tao or more attuned with the Tao in resolving not liking my daughter-in-law's husband than killing him, right? Like, I mean, yeah, and I mean, these are very complicated things, especially when you get into more and more complicated kind of social situations. But that kind of, I guess, again, that's where the kind of Taoist view, the Taoist principles come in, right? Because it's like, well, where is it in Taoism that you find that as the kind of life principle? You know, kill your daughter-in-law's husband, do your daughter's husband.
Yeah.
It's like, I don't know where you find that.
Well, the interesting thing about it, right, is that it's at least the way I understood it, it's a storytelling tradition, right? It's not, it breaks from Taoism very hard in that sense. If you imagine Lao Tzu as a killer, right? So so we easily could just go, oh, that's not Taoist at all. But then again, it's a storytelling tradition, right? So it very well, because and there are lots of more details in there, you know, jokes about what Wu Wei is, for instance, and that it is again, it's a way of engaging with, you know, in a world that, you know, where everybody is practicing sacrifice, and you're like, well, okay, I'm not.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I think is so part of, you know, my view of this is, do you have like a kind of clear sense of what you're cultivating?
Yeah.
You know, and then are you also clear on the consequences of cultivating that? Because I can probably guarantee you someone else is going to show up and kill you when you're not looking, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if that's right, I mean, so I mean, you might get away with it for a while.
I
And they
can't
might be
remember.
like, well,
I'm missing part of that story.
I know, but
the
it's
way.
like, well,
People
no,
need to
you're
read the
Lao Tzu.
article.
You're Lao Tzu.
Yeah.
But what I'm trying to get to is, I think there's this other way of looking at it. And again, I think it's this deeper layer of Taoism that gets distorted by the kind of engagement with it as a set of ideas, right? Which is like the actual energetics of it. So if De or inner power virtue is this kind of energetic, has this energetic quality to it, you know, if you follow that and you listen to the energetics of it, it's very clear, you know, whereas like when you don't, the consequences are very clear. And so then it's like, oh, well, I'll just try to keep following this, saying yes to this, even in the midst of this insanity, like so many people are facing now, which is like, well, how can you, you know, cultivate De in this world, in this society? And it's like, yeah, it's challenging, but I always joke, it's like, well, you know, the Tao Te Ching says, my words are very easy to understand and very easy to practice. No one in the world understands them, no one's right. So it was over before it began. The Taoists actually helped us out, right?
Or how long has it been since normal seemed normal, right?
It's not like medieval Japanese Buddhism where they go, now the Buddha's teachings have been so lost, nobody can become enlightened. Taoists were like, it was over before it began. So you can just relax that problem, right? Like, it's always been this way. You know, and the Zhuangzi even says that, right? 10,000 generations from now, and you're like, whoa, 10,000 generations? When is that? You know, and of course, you know, it's like just a way of saying it's never going to end. But I think there are these elements of Taoism that are like, you know, that's not, don't focus on that. Don't focus on the absence. Don't focus on the corruption. Don't focus on the degeneration, because it's always going to be like this in varying degrees. Like, you can choose to cultivate this.
Well, it's pretty great conversation. I'm totally, I mean, we can go on forever, but we should probably find a way to end it. Let me ask you specifically, because I know you weren't like on my immediate radar. I apologize for that. I don't know why exactly, but I ran into someone at the Daoist conference, was last summer, yeah. And said they were involved in the translation of the Baoputsu with you. Could you say what the Baoputsu is and how that's going? And I guess I should say that it's been translated, and it's the prime example of the worst translation ever.
Yeah, so James Ware's translation from 1966 is it's interesting going through it systematically because his translation's actually fairly good in terms of the Chinese literati tradition. And
Mm,
it's fairly good in terms of the kind of like proto-scientific aspect. And it's catastrophic on the Daoist side.
mm,
So the problem is there's no way to separate those layers out. They're all mixed together in the text. So, you're reading along and you go, oh, okay, yeah, there's this literary illusion and there's this intertextuality. And now, what is this about? And it's like he has no idea what the
yeah,
technical meaning of Taoist terms are.
yeah.
And he has no idea of like what they're actually talking about. So in the kind of short version of it is, I think it was like, yeah, 2 summers ago, we run this Daoist Studies summer seminar. So 2 summers ago, I taught, led the seminar on translating Daoist literature. That's what it was on, right? So it's to try to help people who wanted to like get some kind of foundational classical Chinese, but really to have more of a bilingual engagement with Daoism. And in the process of doing that, but also a lot of my work over the last 2 years has kind of been, what should I say, like kind of culling through all these materials that I have that I didn't really work on because I was so busy, and kind of systematizing it, clearing it out and polishing it up. And then kind of saying, all right, well, I've got all these kinds of catalog kind of projects that I've been doing. And one of them is to think through like what Taoist literature has been translated, what Taoist literature still needs to be translated. And obviously that's endless, but you go, but there are these texts that are so centrally important historically that either have been translated, like the Heshang commentary, that are kind of catastrophically bad, or things that haven't been translated, and that, I mean, you know this, but maybe a lot of people listening to this won't know this, is, at this point I've translated probably 40 Taoist texts. So it's like I could do some of these things on my own, which I have been doing, but then there are these like monumental undertakings, right? Which is, this chapter has 20 zhuan, so I don't know, it's like 120 Chinese pages, right? Woodblock pages. So it's massive, which is partly why no one's retranslated it or tried to translate it. So I kind of made this list, and then I started thinking, oh, but what I really want to do, it's a bit like global Taoism, but on the Daoist Studies side, which is, I don't know how many people know this, but Daoist Studies as an academic field is just a horrific kind of small-minded field. It's basically 19th century Orientalism. And when you talk to people about Daoist studies who aren't in Daoist studies, they say, really, these people are still in the 19th century? Because it's not me saying that. It's
Wait,
describing.
we got really far off, but could you just say, okay, why is it like the 19th century? Just like 2 reasons?
Well, I think yeah, a couple reasons. I mean, one is thinking about Taoism as a historical artifact,
Okay, right.
not thinking about Taoism as a living and lived tradition, right? Trying to kind of like say, because you can construct Taoism through a certain kind of historical trajectory, then everything else isn't connected to that or isn't Taoist and so on. And so it's like literally like textual reconstructions with a whole set of problematic conceptual frameworks that are never investigated because it's so small. You just control the way people are trained, what they write, how they think. And then when somebody does something radical like Taming the Wild Horse book, right, which is about thinking about the Taoist horse taming pictures that I did, that's doing animal studies, contemplative studies, Taoist studies, and religious studies, it's like, what is this? There's no way to make sense of this. It's like, that's because it's doing something new. So the reason I'm saying all of this is not to kind of rail on Daoist studies, although I'm happy to do that, mainstream Daoist studies, I should say, sinological Daoist studies, happy to do that. We can have a different talk, but is what you get there is it's completely factional, right? And so one of the things I wanted to do was say, oh, could we do something collaborative? Could we do something inclusive that breaks free of this, that opens up the possibility of this cooperation, and that says it's not like my Louis Komjathy's next book, there's this whole group of people who are working together to not just translate it, but annotate it, which is the kind of key thing. So I have this pretty long list of texts that I think need to be translated, but that, like I said, would be monumental. It's still monumental, right? But then what I did is I had all these people that were partly connected to the seminar and then a larger kind of group of people. And I just put out this idea for it. And then luckily a lot of them said, yeah, this sounds really good. And we had a meeting and I said, I'm thinking of, we'll start with the Bao Puzi Nepian, the inner chapters of Master Embracing Simplicity. There's some other really good choices, but I think like this is monumental. And if we do it, it will be a major contribution. And you know, at that point, I still do, I guess, have ideas for more, but we'll see. So the quick piece, and then you can just ask me if there's any other things you want to know. The quick aspect of it is, so we started about 1.5 years ago. We do one chapter at each meeting. We meet once a month. And so we're on chapter 14. So there are 20. So we're getting pretty close now. Yeah. So the challenge is that's the kind of like, it's not just the draft translation, it's a revised draft translation with preliminary kind of annotations, but there's a lot of that kind of work to do. And then the second part of your question that maybe some listeners won't know is that the Bao Puzi Nepian is a text written by Ge Hong, right, who's one of the kind of principal systematizers of what's called the Tai Ching, the Great Clarity Movement. You know, so this text, it technically dates to 320 CE. So it's relatively late compared to the classical Taoist materials we were talking about at the beginning, but quite early in Taoist history. So when you kind of think about it, right, historically, it's like there's the Celestial Masters. If you want to talk about it, there's Taiping, Great Peace, that movement, and then Tai Ching, Great Clarity. So one of the very earliest and most important early medieval movements. And there's a lot that's really interesting about the Bao Puzi Nepian, so I'll just leave it at this, which is it's kind of covering everything that's going on kind of regionally. That's why a lot of people, I think, didn't dare to try to translate again, because it's like you need to know the kind of Chinese literati tradition, you need to know like herbology and mineralogy because it's a Waidan, it's an external alchemy text. There's all this stuff really interestingly about Yang Sheng nourishing life practice, what you brought up, Dao Yin practice, other kinds of related practices, also meditation. So it's, you know, a lot of times it's talked about as like a kind of summa of 4th century Chinese religiosity. And it's been engaged a lot. So it's not an unknown text. It's just, we've got this outdated text that everybody still cites. So what they'll cite the parts that are, I think, relatively reliable, and then they'll retranslate all the catastrophically bad stuff, which is what I'm the most interested in, right? And I think probably you as well, which is, oh, yeah, he's got this really deep understanding of the Tao. He has this really deep understanding, his own understanding of the Taoist tradition. This is something that's come up over the course of the translation, is he can say there are these other Taoists who are constructing the tradition this way, and they're kind of misguided. This is how you have to understand Taoism. So it's a kind of intra-Taoist debate where he's saying, look, if you're not doing what you brought up, Jin Dan, the golden elixir, there's no point, right? And so that's kind of his primary emphasis. But in the process of doing that, he's saying, well, if you're going to do Yang Sheng practice, this is how it fits, or this is how herbs fit. We're not that interested in herbology, but then he goes, let me demonstrate my herbology knowledge to you. You go, oh my God. So there's a bunch of people, you know, who have Chinese medical backgrounds and have translated. So they're helping with that, like the identification of particular medical.
Working with Stanley Baker, Michael Stanley Baker?
No, he's not involved in it.
But there's someone else in that realm from that.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. So yeah, it's a pretty good group. It's not a lot of people, what people inside of global Taoism would know, but other people might not. So, you know, it's like I'm the senior Taoist, you know, scholar in it, but there are people who are at different levels. Some people are getting their PhDs. Some people, you know, are trying to be, I guess, mainstream academics. We'll see what happens, but there aren't any jobs in mainstream academia. So, yeah.
So they're having fun. They're having fun. That's a really amazing project. I should should ask, when you do this, you've been doing a yearly translation project.
monthly
What are
for a
you,
year and a half.
is that easy easily that project? But I mean the one that's open where you actually teach
Oh yeah, that's
how.
open. That's on the Daoist Foundation website.
Cool.
Yeah, and I was
Make
going to
sure to
mention
link that.
it. I don't know if you've seen the primer for translating Daoist literature that I did, but that's actually kind of came out of that seminar and then is informing it. We're probably going to have another one with what am I trying to say? Purple Cloud Institute. Yeah, Purple Cloud Institute. They published it. Purple Cloud Press published it. But the reason I'm bringing that up is inside of that book is the principles for Daoist translation that we call it the Daoist Translation Committee, that we composed together to kind of say, this is our vision of like kind of what we're doing, but also if some of our conversations, if it's not just about having reliable translations in English, but we want reliable translations of Daoist texts that have some kind of informing Daoist understanding, how will we do the translation? So that's been a kind of ongoing process in all of these kinds of projects, which is how do you not fall into the trap of, well, this is my personal experience, so let me explain this to you, versus kind of the things we're talking about, which is like the cultural context. And this is very clear on the Baopudza project, which is if it's later, than 330, because supposedly Gohong revised this text in 330 CE, you can't cite it.
But then it was reassembled by Dao Hongjing, right? It was like broken up. Do I have that story wrong? It was broken
The
up and
Shannon
reassembled.
Bancao Jing is more of that text, so it depends on. But in this case, it's like we've got an early text that probably is, kind of final revision was in 330. So when we look at it, and luckily there's a fair amount of primarily modern Chinese scholarship, text critical stuff. So we get to avoid some of those challenges of like trying to create like a text critical edition. But the reason I'm bringing this up is it's like we could read it when it's done and say, oh, this is really interesting from a modern global Taoist perspective. It's like, that's fine. But what did it mean in the 4th century? What does this really happen? And this has come up a lot with like the herbs. Is this kind of, standardized Chinese materia medica identification, the plant that Gohong's talking about? So some of that, it's going to probably be impossible to know for sure.
Well, yeah, I mean, something like an herb, the actual effect of an herb over 1,500 years might be entirely different.
Yeah.
Today, even the same herb, it looks the same, but its pharmacology could have changed. I mean,
well, and the good part is in a lot of the passages that are quite technical, he'll say this herb is good for this, and when you check the materia medica, it corresponds. So it's easier we can get closer, I think, to some of these things, but some of them also look like regional names of substances. So there's all these very technical things. Luckily, I mean, we're almost done with 14, and there's probably only been about 6 of those moments. Whereas in some of the other things I've tried to translate, I'm like, what is this?
Well, I just want to formally thank you for doing that work. I mean, that you have the appetite for it is a blessing to everyone.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. I think it's really challenging, but I do see it as important, and it's kind of like, we're starting to get like the Huainanzi, right? Now we've got like a solid, academic translation of the whole Huainanzi. We have that for the Guanzi. I think this will be that for the Baopudza. So if we keep doing that, little by little, then I think people like ourselves who are really interested in Taoist literature will have access. And it doesn't mean everybody's going to agree on it, but it's like, at least when you open it up, it's reliable and it's accurate, and then there just might be things, right, that you disagree with the translation or the interpretation of.
Right. Well, I mean, that's like you and I are positioned for all sorts of reasons to have a kind of access to this. That, I mean, for one, we know how to read. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't know how to read these days, but that is, I mean, like you're saying that, and I'm like, oh yeah, I would have access if Louis wrote it, I'll have access to it, right? But a lot of people still won't.
Right.
Like it is an interesting, I'm just sort of commenting on the transmission
And why
part.
do you say that? Because they're getting everything online and digital, or
Because
why?
because it takes a certain type of concentration. It takes
Uh-huh.
an understanding of what fundamentally goes
Mhm.
into to a translation,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
There are reading skills that, that take a very long time to pick up,
Hmm.
and a certain type of mentoring,
Yeah.
usually. Um, and it's just a comment on, on the transmission issue, that um, I don't know if we need some intermediate process, or we need to think about, like, are is there a, you know, I guess I'll make it into a question for you. Like, you have a beginner program, right? What's it look like?
Right, right. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think this has been my ongoing challenge with the way I approach things, is I kind of start out at some master's level, and then it's like, okay, but I mean, Kate always says this to me, people don't live in your mind. It's like,
Right.
okay, right. So how are you, and it's like, can you go back, to when you were 19 or 20 and starting this process?
Yeah.
It's like, okay, I think I can. And then it's like, okay, well, imagine that's who you're trying to take through this process, to at least have them be able to understand, some of these materials. And this has definitely come up because I don't know if you've looked at the more recent stuff that I've done, but it's a lot more bilingual, including a lot of glossaries, right? And so the response from a good number of people has been, yeah, it's good, but there's a lot of technical terminology. And so it's like, right, but that's kind of the level I want to work on now, which is like being able to do it bilingually and not
Hmm.
expect you to be bilingual, but at least
Hmm.
that you're open, to that. And I
Hmm.
think that, yes, I see that, and I've been working on it, I think, to try to make it more accessible, and thinking through these very things, like, well, like you said, is there a kind of beginner level? And that's what one of the challenges with the translation primer is, it's impossible to kind of say to people, I'm going to take you from zero classical Chinese to translating Taoist literature in a book. So what I try to do is say, look, here's these resources. You can use them for all of this kind of foundational stuff. I'm not, and so and not to belabor the point, but one of the things that came up is I kind of picked up with, I'm just going to talk about the Daoist technical terminology. And Johann Hausen, who's the publisher, and then Kate were like, no one's going to be able to pick it up here. So then I put in all the stuff on the grammar and the syntax as a separate paragraph, and said, okay, people who know classical Chinese probably don't need this, but the majority of people will. So I'll kind of say, this is the kind of short version of the kind of grammar and syntax, and then if you need to, you can use those other kind of resources like technical publications. So yeah, I'm trying. I think it's challenging, right? Because normally this kind of work would be done at a university, right? And you would have more funding, and you'd have graduate students, but the problem with that, as you know, is that's not democratic. And a lot of the people doing it, it's just careerism, and I'm not interested in that anymore. I mean, what I'm interested in is helping people who have sincerity, who have the kind of appetite for it, and who are, it's their own interest. And that's where I feel like this is a better position for me, is to kind of say to people, oh, you're interested in this? Great. Let's go with
Well,
that.
well, let me just make a pitch for you. Like, if anybody out there's listening to this and has a bunch of money that they want to contribute,
Right.
Louis will use it well. I can guarantee that.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I mean, it is amazing. I think that that's the we're both in the same camp at this point of trying to create our own educational institutions. Yours is way further along than mine. Mine is maybe much more idiosyncratic.
Yeah,
Um,
but I think trying to find, I mean, a lot of my own kind of thinking about this, but also background work. I don't know if you saw this, like a document that I put together on secret schools, but I have this
yes,
like,
yeah.
yeah, and it's like, well, people have been trying to do this forever outside of mainstream education who have different values, but also different projects, right? Like that's what's interesting about it. It's like, oh, weird. Like you did that. I would never do that, but that's cool that you did that. And so part of why I'm bringing this up is that, yeah, I think there's this kind of, I would say, Taoist education project that's like I'm not interested in mainstream academia. I'm not interested in mainstream society. I'm interested in like these weirdos and these freaks like us who are really interested in Taoism in this deep way and are kind of hungry for, to go back to the very beginning of the conversation, some kind of authentic materials and ability to connect with it. And then saying, okay, well, like this is the whole spectrum of possibility as far as I can see. And one of them is this, one of them's translation. Well, does anybody want to do translation together? Well, 14 people said yes. It's like, well, that's encouraging, like,
Yeah.
yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And I will put as many links to this stuff as I can below.
Thanks.
And feel free to send me more.
Yeah.
It's been an absolute delight. I feel like we just scratched the surface,
Yeah.
I think that's how you're always supposed to end a podcast, but really awesome the work you're doing, and I'm really happy we had a chance to talk today. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. You take care.
Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to subscribe and watch the other ones. Also, check out my book, Tai Chi, Bagua Zhang, and the Golden Elixir, Internal Martial Arts Before the Boxer Uprising. Now available as an audiobook, and you can also find me at Scott Park Phillips at substack.com, and check the links below.